Good afternoon. In today's talk, we shall be focusing on the Elizabethan theatre and the stage with specific reference to Marlowe's Dr. Faustus. It's clear that Marlowe wrote Dr. Faustus to be staged. If, as we read, we are to imagine for ourselves the kind of performance that the authors planned when they wrote the plays, we must imagine that performance as taking place in a typical Elizabethan theatre or playhouse. No doubt we should prefer to imagine it in the particular Elizabethan theatre for which Marlowe wrote the play, but we do not know enough about that particular playhouse to be able to do so. Even describing a typical Elizabethan playhouse is hazardous in view of the gaps in our knowledge and understanding as to what exactly were Elizabethan playhouses interior wise. The attempt must be made, however, if Dr. Faustus is to be imagined in anything like the theatrical setting for which it was designed. A full account would necessarily be somewhat inconclusive on numerous points on which scholars disagree. Many of its statements would have to be highly qualified. In my talk, there will be a lot of ifs and buts and assumptions because there are definite gaps in the way in which the stage was managed with all its settings to house or stage Dr. Faustus. In Marlowe's England, the theatre had its obvious enemies. The most vocal of these were the Puritans, so called from their conviction that the Protestant Reformation of the Church under Queen Elizabeth I had not gone far enough and that a further purification from Catholic forms and ceremonies were essential. Strict, precise, and scrupulous, they distrusted worldly pleasure. They abhorred and hated the May games and other traditional festivities, and they hated stage plays. Was not the wearing of women's clothes by the boys who took the female parts a flagrant defiance of Holy Scripture? Had not the fathers of the church and even the worthier pagans condemned common prayers? Had not the pagan plays originated in idolatry? And who could deny that acting itself is a form of falsehood? Above all, Puritan propagandists insisted that the English drama of their time was blasphemous and immoral. Plays were the snares of the devil, they said, and the theatre was the school of Baudry and the chapel of Satan, and the playhouses were hotbeds of sexual vice. Puritanism was strong in the middle class from which came Lord Mayor and the Corporation of the City of London. These men objected to the theatre not only as Puritans but also as civic dignitaries. Would it not tempt, they thought, apprentices to rowdiness and idleness? Was it not responsible in a city in which the plague was endemic for much spreading of infection? Did it not provide a convenient rendezvous for criminal and turbulent characters? And the case for suppressing the theatre apparently was very strong. The hostility of the civic authorities of the time caused the builders of the first permanent playhouses in the London area, which were also the first in England, to choose sites just outside the jurisdiction of the city. Thus, the theatre, the earliest of all, was erected slightly north of London in 1576. It was pulled down some 22 years later, and the timber was used for building the famous Globe Theatre. This stood on the bankside to the south of the River Thames, again just beyond the control of the corporation. For a short time, London's entertainment industry flourished there, but throughout Marlowe's adult life, the main centre of theatrical activity remained to the north of the city. In 1589, when he was involved in a sword fight in Hog Lane near Finsbury Fields, in the course of which his friend Thomas Watson the poet killed a man, Marlowe seemed to have been living conveniently near to the playhouses in that area called the theatre and the curtain. A typical public or open air playhouse appears to have been a roughly cylindrical structure enclosed in an unroofed circular yard. The yard was quite small. Its area was not much greater than that of maybe a modern day lawn tennis court. Moreover, a good third of it was covered by a broad rectangular platform stage about 5 feet high, which projected halfway across it in such a fashion as to leave space for the spectators on the three sides. These spectators, generally known as the groundlings, might have had paid 1 penny for admission. They remained standing. Members of the audience who were willing to pay an extra penny or 2 pence had access to the galleries, usually 3 in number, running round the inside of the building. Here they could sit under the shelter of a thatched or tiled roof. A seat in a private room, or what we know today as the box, immediately adjoining the stage, or a stool on the stage itself, would cost 6 pence or a shilling. The significance of these figures will be clear if you remember that 6 pence was the price of a printed playbook or a good London Elizabethan dinner. The main part of the stage itself was a platform or apron stage, already described as projecting deeply into the yard. The wall at its rear was pierced by a wide central aperture, admitting to a shallow discovery space. This aperture would be closed by curtains. The section of the second gallery, which ran immediately above the discovery space, seems normally to have been reserved for use by the players as a balcony or an upper stage, as the plot permitted. These too could apparently be curtained off. From their own quarters, the tiring house, which lay behind all this, the actors had access to the main stage through two doors flanking the central aperture in its rear wall. They had also direct access to the discovery space and the upper stage. 3 secondary features of the physical structure have a special interest for the students and for us while we discuss the staging of Dr. Faustus. First, above each of the doors admitting the performers to the main stage, there is on either side of the balcony or upper stage, there must have been a window. Second, the main stage was equipped with trapdoors for spectacular effects. Third, the main stage was covered over by a roof known as the shadow or the heavens. This sheltered the players from rain. Built partly over it and partly at the top of the tiring house was a hut with machines and traps for aerial ascents and descents, and in particular for the raising and lowering of the theatre's throne or the state. No scenery was used in this theatre except perhaps for an occasional backcloth in the discovery space. A reference in the dialogue usually sufficed to suggest a particular locality when necessary. Thus, the last line of the prologue to Dr. Faustus tells us that Faustus is in his study, and the opening lines of scene 9, for example, make it clear that the action has moved to the court of the Emperor Charles V. But very often, the particular stage stood for nowhere in particular, or to be more exact, any place where the characters on it may plausibly be supposed to have met. This being so, an Elizabethan dramatist did not think himself obliged to state the locality at the head of each scene of his text. On the bare main stage, in the middle of the tiny auditorium, almost the whole of each play would be presented. But the discovery space and the upper stage, and possibly even parts of the yard, were also available. The players made suggestive use of these. The discovery space could stand for any narrowly confined area. When its curtains were drawn back at the beginning of scene 1 of Dr. Faustus, for example, the protagonist was discovered there, quote unquote, in his study. This does not mean that the space was as large as we should normally expect a study to be. It was probably just large enough for Dr. Faustus to sit in it, maybe with a few books on the table. As he spoke his opening soliloquy, he would conventionally rise to his feet and advance to a more commanding position on the main stage. The whole main stage would then stand for the study, which the discovery space had initially suggested. In Shakespeare's theatre, for example, the discovery space would hold Portia's caskets in The Merchant of Venice, maybe the supposed statue of Hermione in The Winter's Tale, and no doubt filling it almost to capacity, the bed on which Juliet lies in a death-like trance in Romeo and Juliet. The upper stage frequently served as a wall of a besieged city. For example, in the first part of Henry VI, it represented at different times the defenses of no fewer than 4. The text requires the actors to make bold and spectacular use of it. The defenders of one of the 4 cities have to leap from the wall in their shirts. This stage direction serves to remind us how small the Elizabethan theatre was physically. If actors could leap down from the upper to the main stage without injuring themselves, the difference in height can hardly have been more than maybe 6 feet or 5 feet. The upper stage served also as Juliet's balcony in Romeo and Juliet. When Henry VIII, for example, stood there to eavesdrop on his counsel, he was using it in a way that is of some interest to the students of Marlowe's theatre. On a small stage, it can be very difficult to present a scene in which an eavesdropper has to be invisible to the other characters but in full view of the audience. Elizabethan producers got round this difficulty by allowing the eavesdropper to make a purely conventional use of the upper stage. We may reasonably suppose that it was so used by the diabolical characters who watch Faustus conjure in scene 3 and who gloat over his agony in scene 19. I hope this information would help us in visualizing the physical space on the Elizabethan stage on which Marlowe's Dr. Faustus was staged. Thank you.